Okay, so I want to welcome all of you. Thank you all for coming. What we're going to be talking about tonight is going to be talking about Windows Azure websites. If you remember the history of Windows Azure, you know that several years ago Windows Azure came out and there was some basic capabilities in the form of things like called web roles and worker roles, but people who had to develop applications found they had to use totally different APIs. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. First, a little bit about me. Again, this is my history. Those of you who've been at previous meetings know that I'm one of the leaders of this group. I'm a cloud architect and .NET developer, mostly Microsoft focused. I've worked with Windows Azure and Amazon Web Services, although clearly my specialty is Windows Azure. And I've been involved in .NET from the very beginning of .NET. In fact, I was a classical ASP and Visual Basic developer way back. So that's my background. I've worked with Windows Azure for about 6 years now. And for those of you who know the history of Windows Azure, you know that it hasn't actually been out for 6 years. But I started working with it when it was an internal Microsoft product when I used to work for Microsoft. So I discovered it and decided that the cloud was the future. And so far the rest of the world is starting now to catch up to where I am in terms of cloud. Okay? I'm also very big on user groups, which is one of the reasons I started this group. In New York, where I used to live, I've actually founded several user groups. Windows Azure group, the local .NET group, software architects group, and I helped a lot of other user groups get started. So I'm a big believer in community. Okay. I've built applications and helped people build applications on Windows Azure and Amazon Web Services. And I've written a few books and white papers. This is my contact information. It's my email address. I used to have a blog called Cloudy in New York, and clearly when I moved here 6 months ago, I had to change that to Cloudy in Nashville. So that's my blog. It's my LinkedIn and other contact information. This is actually a picture of my blog. All right. I did a blog series about a few months ago on moving applications to the cloud. In other words, taking a look at your existing applications and deciding which ones are appropriate to move to the cloud and which ones you should leave alone and not move to the cloud. And you notice I just pasted Nashville over New York. That was a temporary edit, and then I decided that I liked it, so we decided to keep it that way. So this is this is showing the three-part blog post of to cloud or not to cloud. And this particular post was on the showstoppers, reasons why you might not want to move to the cloud, or objections that you have to overcome when moving to the cloud. So what is this cloud thing anyway? Well, if you think about data centers and you think about capacity in data center, you have to do capacity planning. But the problem with capacity planning and the problem with data centers is that you can't buy continuous increases in capacity. You have to buy servers in big chunks. So traditionally, although your forecast is like the dotted line there, what you have to buy is usually more than that and in big quantum chunks. So what happens though when you really get to operating your data center is load is not exactly the same as what you'd forecast. Load fluctuates, goes up and down. So that's great. There's a part of that curve where you have too much capacity, so you're wasting money. There's an even worse part of that curve where you don't have enough capacity. And that's when your users are screaming and your website is coming down and response time is slow. When I was audited by Price Waterhouse back when I was running a data center, they asked me how I decided when to increase the capacity. And I said, well, if I have too much capacity and spend too much money, I'm going to get yelled at. If I don't have enough capacity, I'm going to get fired. So that was pretty easy, pretty easy decision to make. I just spend more than I needed to get the capacity. But what you really want is you really want to be able to utilize resources and pay for what you need as you need it. And with the cloud and Windows Azure and even Amazon Web Services, that's the world you're living in. You can increase gradually. You can increase in response to demand. You can increase, by time of day, periodically, whatever it takes. And of course, you don't have any screaming customers here, which is the important thing. Okay? There are a few patterns, and again, we're going to talk about Windows Azure websites, but it's important to understand what applications are appropriate for running in the cloud and which aren't. These are the major patterns. Anytime you have an application that's subject to on-off type processing, where you might only need processing at the end of the month or at the end of the day, but you don't need that excess capacity. Why pay for servers to sit idle, when you don't need them? So the on-off pattern is one of the patterns, and if you have an application that looks like that, it might be a good candidate for the cloud. There's a couple of others like growing fast. Like you may have a great idea, and it may be the next Facebook or the next YouTube, but maybe not. So do you want to go out and spend a whole bunch of money on servers? No, you want to start small and grow gradually, but if the curve should suddenly become exponential, you want to be able to accommodate that. So that's the growing fast. There's two bursting scenarios. There's predictable bursting. Predictable bursting is where at certain times of the year or certain times of the month or certain times of the day, you're going to have a peak demand. And this is actually the pattern that created the whole cloud revolution to begin with. Because Amazon, who was the first company into the cloud, had excess capacity. Why? When do you think their busy period is? Christmas, right? The Christmas rush. So they have to have a huge server plant just to support that towards the end of the year, and the rest of the year it was idle. So they wanted to sell that capacity. They've gone way beyond that, and they're really in the cloud business just like Microsoft is, selling new capacity. But that's how it started. The other one's kind of interesting. It's the unpredictable bursting pattern. They call that the slash dot pattern, where you have a website and you're getting modest traffic, and then suddenly somebody notices you and publicizes the fact that you exist. That you may have that exponential increase in load, but it may not last, right? It may go down eventually. So you want to be able to scale up and also scale down as appropriate. This is a chart that shows all of Windows Azure. And there's a lot to Windows Azure. In fact, there's a whole wall-sized poster that this blows up into. There's a lot of features of Windows Azure. We're not going to discuss many of these features. We're going to focus on that little box down there on the compute row that says websites, because Windows Azure has a lot of features. If any of you came to my talk a couple of months ago, you know that we went through an overview of all the features, and that talk was a long talk and took over an hour to get through. There's a ton of features, and what we'll do is we'll focus on Windows Azure websites. Now, there's a lot of different ways to look at websites, and there's a lot of different features in Windows Azure. If you're running in your data center and you're running an application there, you're really supporting that whole stack on the left. In other words, you have hardware, you have some kind of virtualization layer nowadays, right? You have an operating system, network layer, firewalls, and finally, when all that plumbing is taken care of, you get to focus on your data and your applications, which is really what your business cares about, right? So the first thing that came out was virtualization and virtual machines, and Windows Azure supports that with a feature called Infrastructure as a Service, or IaaS, which basically lets you rent server capacity as you need it in the cloud. Do pretty much anything that you can do on-premise in the cloud. Of course, subject to the fact that there's certain latency when dealing with the cloud that you might not have when dealing with your local data center. So, interactive responses might take a fraction longer if you're talking to an application running up in the cloud versus if you're running in your data center, unless you're running in your data center and you're constrained by capacity, whereas you're not constrained by capacity in the cloud because you can scale up. Okay? Cloud services is what Microsoft originally came out with Windows Azure several years ago. Things called web and worker roles, where basically they took care of a lot of that plumbing for you. And worrying about applying patches to your operating system, you just had to focus on your applications and data, but you did have some infrastructure responsibilities. People felt that that was great. One of the downsides of that was that you had to program those applications with special APIs. So you could have a SQL Server database in the cloud, you could have cloud storage in the cloud, NoSQL storage in the cloud, but you actually wrote, programmed special APIs. As a result, you couldn't actually run that application in your data center. The most recent development, Windows Azure Websites, which is also a platform as a service, lets you focus on your applications and data, number one. And two, it lets you not worry about any of that plumbing. So in other words, you run your application and in your website just the way you'd run it on premise in your data center. You can even develop an application, run it on premise some of the time, and then move it up into the cloud and run it at other times. Okay? So that's what websites are good for. Okay. The main purpose for Windows Azure Websites is to support a website web farm application where you have an application with a relational or no other kind of database in the back end. And right now, Windows Azure Website supports SQL Server, SQL Azure, or MySQL database. So Microsoft's really doing a lot of open source stuff with Windows Azure. Like they support Node and Ruby and Python, and they even support Linux in their infrastructure as a service offering. So, they're really working with the open source community. So you can have a Windows Azure website as a web server or a web server farm with a SQL, with relational database in the back end. They also offer a really great bargain in that there's a free tier. You can have up to 10 free websites in Windows Azure. Won't cost you a thing. If you are, however, running in a shared environment with other users, if you need better performance than that provides, they have two additional tiers that you do wind up paying for. There's a shared, which is still shared, but you get more capacity, and a reserved tier, which gives you the best performance and the biggest capacity of all. And again, this is all defined out, described out on Microsoft's website. The 10 free website deal is a great deal for companies that are like startups. A brand new company that may not have a lot of cash to invest. They could put up a website or even 4 or 5 websites and see what the load is going to be, and then decide whether they're really going to make a go of it or not. So that's great for startups. Also, websites are easy to deploy your on-premise applications with. There's all kinds of ways to test an application on-premise and then deploy it up into the cloud. Not only Microsoft tools like Visual Studio and WebMatrix, but also things like FTP and Git and Dropbox and a whole bunch of other tools that you can use to actually push an application up into the cloud once you've developed it on a laptop or in your data center. Okay? But the last point is really important in that it's compatible with applications that you'd run in your data center. So you can run an application, move it up to the cloud, even move it back from the cloud, depending upon what your needs are. So what we're going to do is, slides are kind of cold. What we're going to do is we're going to go through some demos, and I'm going to show you exactly how easy and how quick it is to build a Windows Azure website. And what we'll do is we'll quick create a website. You can build it with a database. You can even build it from a gallery of products. For instance, if you want a WordPress blog site, you can actually pick that from a menu and it'll install it for you. Okay? We'll show the dashboard that you get with Windows Azure to do performance monitoring, and we'll talk about how you can use that dashboard to make configuration changes to your website. And we'll talk about those free shared and reserved environments that you can run in. This is the Windows Azure website. You go to www.windowsazure.com, and you sign in. You do have to have a live ID. By the way, if anybody out there is an MSDN subscriber, they have an MSDN account, or a BizTalk subscriber if they're a startup, you get a bunch of free Windows Azure resources every month to use without getting billed for them. So it's kind of a bargain. It's kind of leaving money on the table if you don't take advantage of that. Oops, session is timed out. So this is the Windows Azure portal. In one place you can see, excuse me, you can see all the resources that you own. Now what I've done is I have actually deleted all my resources. Up until recently, you used to pay for resources that we were using, even if nobody was hitting your website. So you had to actually undeploy your application, take it out of the cloud. They've since changed that so that all you have to do now is stop the application and you won't be charged anymore.
When did they make that change?
About a month ago.
Oh my gosh, because that killed me. They told me
Yeah.
to delete it all and then restore it if I wanted to do any of that, and
Yeah.
I just left it.
Yeah, it's kind of like telling
So it's logical.
Yeah, it's kind of like telling a developer at the end of the day, after you finish testing, you'd have to delete all your executables. You know?
Yeah.
And nobody wanted to do that, and it took a while for them to do that. Okay,
That's great.
This is the portal, and you can see all the different services that Windows Azure supports, and you can allocate things, and and we don't have time to go through all of this. What we'll do is we'll take a look at the website one. You click on websites, and it says you have no websites. Let's create one. So we'll create one. You click on this, and what you get is an interesting screen. You get the ability to create a website with 3 options. You can either quick create, custom create, or create it from a gallery. So quick create is good. All you have to do is specify that you want a website, and they'll fire one up for you right away. You can create it with or without a back-end database. You can also create a custom website, and this is that gallery. I'll show you in a bit when we get there. What I'm going to do is you specify a high-end qualifier for your website URL. So I'm going to use WHZCO, Wizco, because I have a fondness for that name, because I used to own a company. Those are my initials, WHZ. So I used to own a company called Wizco, and that is how you create it. So we'll do a quick create. We'll create the website, and within less than a minute, they will fire up that website. Now, if you've done anything with web and worker roles, you know that sometimes it takes 5 or 10 minutes to actually get your site started, because they have to go around and allocate switches and allocate virtual machines and do all kinds of stuff. Well, with websites, they've got a lot of capacity, especially shared. They've got a lot of capacity sitting around idle, so they can fire you up. And you notice I've got a running website already. So that's a running website, and I'll prove to you it's a running website by actually going into the website, and the first thing you see is this dashboard. There's options about downloading tools. This is a performance monitoring dashboard that shows you what's happening on your website from minute to minute. Shows you your status. If we go down here, the website URL, I'll hit the website URL, hopefully. And there's the website, it's running. Now, it's a default page, so you'd have to go in, at some point and modify that page. So far, we haven't even done anything with an application. Got a website.
That's what
Yeah.
I see.
Yep, if you look at the URL, you can see that the URL is http://wizco.azurewebsites.net. By the way, Windows Azure also supports vanity, custom domain names, so that you can actually hide the fact that you're running in Windows Azure from somebody if you really want to. Yeah, it can be wizco.com, for instance, if I wanted to do that. All right, so that's the website, and it's running. What we're going to do, though, is eventually we're going to replace that. We're going to replace that website. This is really interesting. If you take a look at this dashboard that we have here, you notice that there's several tabs: dashboard, monitor, configure, scale, and linked resources. If you look at the dashboard, you can see that you can do all kinds of monitoring and scaling things here. You can turn on auto scaling so that if a particular performance counter hits some limit, you can scale up, scale down. About a week ago or 2 weeks ago, they also announced scheduled scaling, so that, for instance, you can say, I know everybody comes into work on Monday morning at 9 o'clock and they start hitting my website, so I might as well scale up in advance of that and then scale down after that. So they provided that capability. This is showing you, again, a graph of what your performance is like. And that's pretty interesting stuff, because, it's kind of like the stuff you get out of Perfmon, if you're running internally in your data center or System Center, for instance. Monitor lets you actually do even more in that you can actually specify additional things to monitor. So you have some control over what you're monitoring. Configure is a useful tab, and there's a lot of information here. First of all, you can choose the version of the .NET framework that you need to run with. So you can choose the framework version if you're using PHP, because remember, Azure supports all kinds of frameworks, not just .NET. You can choose the version of the framework. You can even specify, here's where you'd specify your custom domain name, for instance. So you can do things here. You can specify logging, and you can get logs sent to your Azure file system as well as to Windows, IIS logs. So if you need to look at your logs, it's easier to retrieve them. Okay, and there's some useful information here. A lot of things you can control and tune right from this dashboard. Okay, get back up here. This is the good one. This is scaling. And with scaling, this is where you can actually decide to change how many resources you have. You can run in that free tier, and if load is increasing, and you're finding that from your monitoring that that you need more capacity, you can simply up it to shared, or even standard, which is a dedicated mode of operating, just by clicking on buttons. Okay, and you can choose. You have various control features here. You can also, if you're running in standard mode, all right, you can decide how many instances. So I've created a web farm just by clicking on a button. In other words, I had one running, right? I said, give me 5 instances. That's 5 virtual machines. In other words, that's 5 machines with IIS running in a web farm, load-balanced architecture. One additional thing that I wanted to show you before we move on to talk about creating a program and uploading it into Azure is to talk about the gallery, since I mentioned that to you earlier. Let's go up to websites, and we'll create a website. And we'll take a look. We'll do a quick create. We won't do a quick create this time. This time we'll do from gallery. So we'll specify a high-end qualifier for my URL, just like we did before, and we'll create from gallery this time. And now it's looking for the list of applications that you can have automatically installed for you by Windows Azure. And here you see a long list of applications that you can install, that can get installed for you. An ASP.NET empty site, Drupal, a ASP.NET starter site, a bakery site. Again, these are some of the sites that you'll see when we look at WebMatrix. But you can see Django, .NET Nuke, HTML5 empty site, Joomla, very popular content management system, and Orchard CMS, and even a whole WordPress site. So that would be a private WordPress site, not the public WordPress site. So you could set up your own blog site in Windows Azure. So that is creating from a gallery. Again, we won't go ahead and create it. I just wanted to give you a demonstration to show you what's out there. Okay, so let's go back to the desktop, and I've got, let's go to my desktop, and let's fire up a development tool that Microsoft provides, and it's a free development tool called WebMatrix. You can do your development with Windows, with Visual Studio and many different versions of with Visual Studio, or you can use the free tool WebMatrix. I'm going to use WebMatrix because it's free and it's easy to use, and it's well integrated with Windows Azure. And this is the opening screen of WebMatrix, and you can see that you can go to a site that you've created previously. You can open a site that you have on your hard drive, or you can create a new site. I'm just going to click on New and create New Site. And you can create it several different ways. You can create it from a template, from a gallery, again, which is similar to the gallery that we were looking at just a few minutes ago, or an empty site. I'm going to click on Template Gallery. And here you see the various templates that you can actually use to create a website. And remember, I'm doing all of this on my hard drive, on my local machine. So eventually, we're going to test this, and eventually we're going to upload it into Windows Azure. So let's just grab the starter site template, and let's install it. Okay. And you can see that they're going to go out there and see where there's locations that you can install it. Now, unfortunately, I've used starter site before, so I'm going to have to change the high-end qualifier of the URL. So that should work. Nope. Okay. Let's let's do Wisgo start. We'll call it Wisgo start. Okay. And you'll see that they actually go out and check to make sure that name is available. So we're going to create it. So we'll do next. And now they're downloading the startup site from the Microsoft site. And pretty soon you'll see a typical ASP.NET website with a default .html page and, you know, kind of a bare bones site. If we run this site locally, you'll see that it's just a vanilla site with a home page, an about page, and a contact page. It's available. You can use it. You know, you can play around with it. Okay. So that is getting the site down. Now, in Web Matrix, I ran it and I debugged it, and I assume that it works correctly since I was able to run it locally. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to publish it to the cloud. And here they'll give you a warning that they're going to upload some files to test to make sure that you can actually upload things to, to Windows Azure. So I'm going to continue. And they will tell you that they're about to upload the files. So I'm going to say continue. And they're going to list the files that they're about to upload. What they'll do is they'll only upload the files that need to be uploaded. So if you make a change to a file and rerun this, they'll only upload the files that are different. Now if you look at the bottom of the screen, you can see that they're actually uploading the files to Windows Azure. They're actually publishing it. And when the publishing is complete, and you click on the URL that's listed at the bottom of the screen, you can see that now we're up running in Windows Azure. As you can tell from the URL, which is wisgostart.azure.websites.net. So that's how you actually create an application, test it locally, and then upload it to Windows Azure and run it in Windows Azure. So let's see, we built and tested an ASP.NET website. We've really only made a minor change, but you can see that a developer could then work with that website to flesh it out. We published it to Windows Azure from Web Matrix. Okay. And again, you saw this. These are my backup slides. For a minute, I thought I was going to have to resort to these, but everything worked out fine. So this is the publishing profile, the default web page that just says "Getting Started Again." The HTML, which you saw, pushing the application files up to there, and getting started again with the Nashville Windows Azure user group. When I did these slides, I typed it a little bit different, but you can see that I actually did make a change. Okay? And that's basically Windows Azure websites in a nutshell. It's pretty efficient. It's pretty fast. It's pretty smooth, and it's totally compatible with online website development that you would do. Some interesting new features that have just happened recently. I told you about scheduled auto scaling, which is a new feature, and the ability to stop a website and not have to undeploy it. I didn't even put that on the list because that's like a month or so old. The Microsoft is coming out with new features in Azure all the time. You know, if you're used to the long alpha, beta, general availability, and release cycle time frame for software in the cloud, you could forget it. It's internet time. So new features come out almost on a monthly or quarterly basis. There's a new Windows Azure Managed Cache. If you need in-memory caching for your application, there's a caching service that you can use in Windows Azure. You can get your IIS logs in your Windows Azure storage account so that you can see them online. You can even specify IP restrictions and control the IP addresses of machines that can access your site. You can do A and C name records in DNS so that you can have a vanity, vanity website name. Beg your pardon?
They're not a register.
No, but they have DNS built in, but clearly you have to have, you have to own the name. You have to own the site and have it registered with, like my site's registered with register.com, so you need a site like that. And it supports SSL, and it supports SSL right now only in shared or standard mode, so that free mode doesn't support SSL. So that's something people are actually asking for, but it's not there yet. Okay, let's take a step back now that we've looked at Windows Azure websites and talk about what to use when. Because remember, Windows Azure has two platform as a service offerings. One is the original web roles and worker roles and services that came out years ago. And the other is websites, which just came out recently. So I would use websites if all I needed was an IIS-based website or web farm architecture with a back-end relational database. If you want to start free, I'd use Windows Azure websites because that's a great feature. But if you don't need to control the software or hardware below that particular level, and also if you want compatibility with your on-premise ASP.NET applications, I'd pick a cloud app, which is what web roles and worker roles were called originally. If you have some complex, sophisticated multi-tier architecture that you have to support. Remember, web role, a website just gives you essentially a two-tier architecture. They give you, a web farm front end with a relational database back end. If you're into building applications that are multi-tier, then you need to fall back on the original capabilities that Windows Azure had. Okay? Of course, infrastructure as a service, providing virtual machines on demand and instances of virtual machines is always a possibility if you need total control over the machine. And if you need to have, let's say you have a really complex legacy application that you want to move up into the cloud, chances are you're going to be looking at the virtual machine, virtual machines as a way to do that. You can also build hybrid applications. In fact, I have another slide which talks a little bit about that, but essentially, there's nothing to prevent you from having a Windows Azure website talking through the Windows Azure Service Bus to an on-premise SQL Server database, or even accessing a Windows Azure application, accessing a SQL Server database on-premise, or vice versa. So there's a lot of things where you can mix and match capabilities over and above what websites provides by itself. This is a little chart, which is I realize it's kind of an eye chart. It shows you the capabilities that a website has versus what web and worker roles have, or web roles. So this will be in the slide deck, and we'll publish the slide deck on the website so you can look at this. There's a lot of features here that websites do that web roles don't do, and vice versa. It really depends upon what you need to do. Here's some handy links and references. You can get a free 90-day Azure account, no questions asked, from Microsoft, and that's at that link. You can also, like I said earlier, if you have an MSDN subscription or you're a BizTalk subscriber, and if you're not a BizTalk subscriber and you're a startup, you really should be, because BizTalk is a great deal from Microsoft. You essentially get everything they make for free. So,
There's $300 a year or something.
yeah, there's some cost, but it's almost. I'm not sure how the program is run right now. When I was at Microsoft, it was you paid $300 at the end to get, when you wanted to get out of the program.
There's a map. It's called Maps, I think. Microsoft Access or Microsoft.
Not sure, but look up BizTalk online, okay? There's a phenomenal set of PowerPoints and presentations and videos called the Windows Azure Training Kit, which is worth money. And if you're doing anything with Windows Azure, you should download the training kit. And it's got all kinds of hands-on labs. It's got all these presentations. Really a great resource. There's a page for Windows Azure websites. There's a lot of how-to guides out there, information on Web Matrix, and if you're into security and finding out about what Windows Azure does with OpenID and support for other authentication systems like Google and Facebook and so forth, there's a good link there for you. And that's it. That's my contact information again. Like I say, I'm a Windows Azure, I'm a cloud and .NET consultant. I've got some business cards up here. And in fact, Stephen Michael Zach, who's my videographer today, has some of his business cards up here. He's in the video business, and also happens to be my son, if you notice the similarity in names. So feel free to take my business card, take his business card at the end. At this point in the meeting, excuse me, at this point in the meeting, we normally have a raffle, and we'll handle that after we stop recording. So I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and go out there and start using Windows Azure.